Continuing Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Pembroke Howard, lawyer and bachelor, aged about 40, was another old Virginian grandee with approved descent from the first families. He was a fine, brave, majestic creature, a gentleman according to the nicest requirements of the Virginia rule, a devoted Presbyterian, an authority on the code, and a man always courteously ready to stand up before you in the field if any act or word of his had seemed doubtful or suspicious to you, and explained it with any weapon you might prefer, from brand awls to artillery. He was very popular with the people, and was the judge's dearest friend. And then there was Colonel Cecil Burleigh Essex, another FFV, a formidable caliber. However, with him we have no concern. Percy Northumberland Driscoll, brother to the judge, and younger than he by 5 years, was a married man and had children around his hearthstone, but they were attacked in detail by measles, croup, and scarlet fever, and this had given the doctor a chance with his effective antediluvian methods. So the cradles were empty. He was a prosperous man with a good head for speculations, and his fortune was growing. On the 1st of February, 1830, 2 boy babies were born in his house, one to him, the other to one of his slave girls, Roxana by name. Roxana was 20 years old. She was up and around the same day with her hands full, for she was tending both babies. Miss Percy Driscoll died within the week. Roxy remained in charge of the children. She had her own way, for Mr. Driscoll soon absorbed himself in his speculations and left her to her own devices. In that same month of February, Dawson's Landing gained a new citizen. This was Mr. David Wilson, a young fellow of Scottish parentage. A young fellow of Scotch parentage. He had wandered to this remote region from his birthplace in the interior of the state of New York to seek his fortune. He was 25 years old, college-bred, and had finished a post-college course in an Eastern law school a couple of years before. He was a homely, freckled, sandy-haired young fellow with an intelligent blue eye that had frankness and comradeship in it, and a covert twinkle of a pleasant sort. But for an unfortunate remark of his, he would no doubt have entered at once upon a successful career at Dawson's Landing. But he made his fatal remark the first day he spent in the village, and it gagged him. He had just made the acquaintance of a group of citizens when an invisible dog began to yelp and snarl and howl and make himself very comprehensively disagreeable, whereupon young Wilson said, much as one who was thinking aloud, "I wish I owned half of that dog." "Why?" somebody asks. "Because I would kill my half." Yeah, don't target the dogs, but the group searched his face with curiosity, with anxiety even, but found no light there, no expression that they could read. They fell away from him as from something uncanny, and went into a privacy to discuss him. One said, "'Pears to be a fool." "Pears?" said another. "I reckon you'd better say." Said, he wished he owned half the dog, the idiot. Said a third, what did he reckon would become of the other half if he had killed his half? Do you reckon he thought it would live? Well, in that case, you don't. You definitely have to take care of what can't be separated, right? Why, he must have thought it, unless he is the downrightest fool in the world. Because if he hadn't thought it, he would have wanted to own the whole dog, knowing that if he killed his half, and the other half died, he would just be responsible for that half just the same as if he had killed that half instead of his own. Don't it look that way to you gents? Well, could be some sort of figure of speech, right? Yes, it does. If he owned one half of the general dog, it would be so. If he owned one end of the dog and another person owned the other end, it would be so. Just the same, particularly in the first case, because if you kill one half of a general dog, there ain't any man that can tell whose half it was. But if he owned one end of a dog, maybe it could kill his end of it, and no, he couldn't either. He couldn't and not be responsible if the other end died, which it would. In my opinion, the man ain't in his right mind. In my opinion, he ain't got any mind. Number 3 said, well, he's a lummox anyways. That's what he is, said number 4. He's a labrick. Just a Simon Pure labrick, if ever there was one. Yes, sir, he's a damn fool. That's the way I put him up, said number 5. Anybody can think different that he wants to, but those are my sentiments. I'm with you, gentlemen, said number 6. Perfect jackass, yes, and it ain't going too far to say he's a pudd'nhead. If he ain't a pudd'nhead, I ain't no judge, that's all. Well, this insulting of animals, for the sake of humans, I kind of don't like that. Mr. Wilson soon elected. The incident was told all over the town and gravely discussed by everybody. Within a week, he had lost his first name. Pudd'nhead took its place. In time, he came to be liked, and well liked too. But by that time, the nickname had got well stuck on, and it stayed. That first day's verdict made him a fool, and he was not able to get it set aside or even modified. The nickname soon ceased to carry any harsh or unfriendly feeling with it, but it held its place, and was to continue to hold its place for 20 long years. Chapter 2. Driscoll spares his slaves. Adam was but human. This explains it all. He did not want the apple for the apple's sake. He wanted it only because it was forbidden. The mistake was in not forbidding the serpent. Then he would have eaten the serpent. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. Pudd'nhead Wilson had a trifle of money when he arrived, and he bought a small house on the extreme western verge of the town. Between it and Judge Driscoll's house there was only a grassy yard with a paling fence dividing the properties in the middle. He hired a small office down in the town and hung out a tin sign with these words on it: David Wilson, attorney and counselor at law, surveying, conveyancing, etc. But as deadly remark had ruined his chance, at least in the law, no clients came. He took down his sign after a while and put it up on his own house, with the law features knocked out of it. He offered his services now in the humble capacities of land surveyor and expert accountant. Now and then he got a job of surveying to do, and now and then a merchant got him to straighten out his books. With Scotch patience and pluck, he resolved to live down his reputation and work his way into the legal field yet. Poor fellow, he could not foresee that it was going to take him such a weary long time to do it. He had a rich abundance of idle time, but it never hung heavy on his hands, for he interested himself in every new thing that was born in the universe of ideas, and studied it and experimented upon it at his house. One of his pet fads was palmistry. To another one he gave no name, whether he would explain to anybody what its purpose was, but merely said it was an amusement. In fact, he said he found that his fads added to his reputation as a pudd'nhead. Therefore, he was growing chary of being too communicative about them. The fad without a name was one which dealt with people's finger marks. He carried in his coat pocket a shallow box with grooves in it, and In the grooves, strips of glass, 5 inches long and 3 inches wide. Along the lower edge of each strip was pasted a slip of white paper. He asked people to pass their hands through their hair, thus collecting upon them a thin coating of the natural oil, and then make a thumb mark on a glass strip, following it with a mark of the ball of each finger in succession. Under this row of faint grease prints, he would write a record on the strip of white paper, thus, John Smith, right hand, and add the day of the month and the year. Then take Smith's left hand on another glass strip and add name and date and the words left hand. The strips were now returned to the grooved box and took their place among what Wilson called his records. He often studied his records, examining and poring over them with absorbing interest until far into the night. But what he found there, if he found anything, he revealed to no one. Sometimes he copied on paper the involved and delicate pattern left by the ball of a finger, and then vastly enlarged it with a pantograph so that he could examine its web of curving lines with ease and convenience. One sweltering afternoon, it was the first day of July, 1830. He was at work over a set of tangled account books in his workroom, which looked westward over a stretch of vacant lots, when the conversation outside disturbed him. It was carried on in yells, which showed that the people engaged in it were not close together. "Say, Roxy, how does your baby come on?" This from the distant voice. "Fust rate." "How does you come on, Jasper?" This yell was from close by. "Oh, I's middling. Hain't got nothing to complain of. I's gwine to come a courtin' you bimby, Roxy. You is, you black mudcat. Ya, ya, ya. I got somepin better to do den sitin wit blacks as black as you is ol' Miss Cooper's Nancy Dunn give you the mitten." Roxy followed this sally with another charge of carefree laughter. And, of course, it doesn't matter what color people's skin is. It's about their character and their actions or whatever, right? "You's jealous, Roxy. That's what the matter with you. You hussy. Ya, ya, ya. That's the time I got you. Oh, yes, you got me. Hain't you? Claw to goodness, if dat conceit a you and strikes in. Jasper, it gwine to kill you, shoo. If you belonged to me, I'd sell you down the river, for you get to forgone. Fust time I runs across the marster, I gwine to tell him so." This idle and aimless jabber went on and on, both parties enjoying the friendly duel, and each well satisfied with his own share of the wit exchange, for wit they considered it. You know, ignorance doesn't mean that people don't know. They don't, they're kind of beyond things, right? They've made a choice. And sometimes very, very intelligent is just full of ignorance. Wilson stepped to the window to observe the combatants. He could not work while their chatter continued. Over in the vacant lots was Jasper, young, coal-black, and of magnificent build, sitting on a wheelbarrow in the pelting sun at work, supposedly where he was, in fact, only preparing for it by taking an hour's rest before beginning. In front of Wilson's porch stood Roxy, with a local, handmade baby wagon in which sat her 2 charges, one at each end and facing each other. From Roxy's manner of speech, a stranger would have expected her to be black, but she was not. Only 1/16 of her was black, and that 16th did not show. Well, maybe didn't appear to make her look any darker, but if there's a 64th, you can find a feature on their head. She was of majestic form and stature. Her attitudes were imposing and statuesque, and her gestures and movements distinguished by a noble and stately grace. Her complexion was very fair, with the rosy glow of vigorous health in the cheeks. Her face was full of character and expression. Her eyes were brown and liquid, and she had a heavy suit of fine soft hair, which was also brown, but the fact was not apparent because her head was bound about with a checkered handkerchief, and the hair was concealed under it. Her face was shapely, intelligent, and comely, even beautiful. She had an easy, independent carriage when she was amongst her own caste, and a highly and sassy way withal. But of course she was meek and humble enough where white people were. To all intents and purposes, Roxy was as white as anybody, but the 1/16th of her, which was black, outvoted the other 15 parts and made her a Negro. Yeah, and we need to drop this racist nonsense that people who aren't who are a majority something else are, oh, you're black. Now, people typically it's about a quarter or something, and they call them black. But if you're more, I mean, you call them white or mixed race, sure, but it just doesn't make sense physically. She was a slave, and salable as such. Her child was 31 parts white, and he, too, was a slave, and by friction of law and custom a Negro. He had blue eyes and flaxen curls like his white comrade, but even the father of the white child was able to tell the children apart, little as he had commerce with them by their clothes, for the white babe wore ruffled soft muslin and a coral necklace, while the other wore merely a coarse tow linen shirt, which barely reached to its knees, and no jewelry. The white child's name was Thomas Becket Driscoll. The other name was Valet de Chamber, no surname. Slaves hadn't the privilege. Roxana had heard that phrase somewhere. The fine sound of it had pleased her ear, and as she had supposed it was a name, she loaded it into her darling, onto her darling, and it soon got shortened to Chambers, of course. Now, whether or not that was the, it wasn't the American system, but two things that were that are the rights of slaves is that they maintain their, the name of their father. That's their right to have. And also this insulting, overworking, and all this other stuff. No. And I guess the third one is that you don't get born into slavery. Now the mother may have the right to keep the children with her or something, but they're not slaves when they grow up, or and they're not put in slave labor when they're kids. Wilson knew Roxy by sight, and when the duel of wit began to play out, he stepped outside to gather in a record or two. Jasper went to work energetically at once. Perceiving that his leisure was observed, Wilson inspected the children and asked, "How old are they, Roxy?" "Both the same age, sir, 5 months. Bon de fust o February. They're handsome little chaps. One's just as handsome as the other two." A delighted smile exposed the girl's white teeth, and she said, "Bless your soul, Mr. Wilson. It's powerful nice. Oh, you say that, 'cause one of 'em ain't only a black. Mighty prime little black, I always say. But that's 'cause it's mine, of course." "How do you tell them apart, Roxy, when they haven't any clothes on?" Roxy laughed, a proportioned to her size, and said, "Oh, I can tell them apart, Mr. Wilson. But I bet Marcy Percy couldn't, not to save his life." Wilson chatted along for a while, and presently got Roxy's fingerprints for his collection, right hand and left, on a couple of his glass strips, then labeled and dated them, and took the records of both children and labeled and dated them also. 2 months later, on the 3rd of September, he took this trio of finger marks again. He liked to have a series, 2 or 3 takings at intervals during the period of childhood. these to be followed by others at intervals of several years. The next day, that is to say, on the 4th of September, something occurred which profoundly impressed Roxana. Mr. Driscoll missed another small sum of money, which is the way of saying that this was not a new thing, but had happened before. In truth, it had happened 3 times before. Driscoll's patience was exhausted. He was a fairly humane man toward slaves and other animals. Well, humans are animals, but he was an exceedingly humane man towards the erring of his own race, theft. He could not abide, and plainly there was a thief in the house. Necessarily, the thief must be one of his Negroes. Not necessarily, but if they're deprived, it's not quite the same thing, right? It just depends on what their needs are, of course. The sharp measures must be taken. He called the servants before him. There were 3 of these besides Roxy, a man, a woman, and a boy 12 years old. They were not related, Mr. Driscoll said. You have all been warned before. It has done no good. This time I will teach you a lesson. I will sell the thief. Which one of you is the guilty one? They all shuddered at the threat, for here they had a good home, and a new one was likely to be a change for the worse. The denial was general. None had stolen anything, not money. Anyway, a little sugar or cake or honey or something like that. That Marse Percy wouldn't mind or miss, but not money, never a cent of money. They were eloquent in their protestations, but Mr. Driscoll was not moved by them. He answered each in turn with a stern, "Name the thief." The truth was, all were guilty but Roxana. She suspected that the others were guilty, but she did not know them to be so. See, if you assume something, you don't make the accusations. She was horrified to think how near she had come to being guilty herself. She had been saved in the nick of time by a revival in the Colored Methodist Church, a fortnight before, on which time and place she got religion. The very next day, after that gracious experience, while her change of style was fresh upon her, and she was vain of her purified condition, her master left a couple of dollars lying protected on his desk, and she happened upon that temptation when she was polishing around with a dust rag. She looked at the money a while with a steady rising resentment. Then she burst out with, "Dad, blame that revival. I wish it had been put off till tomorrow." Then she covered the tempter with a book and got another member of the kitchen cabinet. She made this sacrifice as a matter of religious etiquette, as a thing necessary just now, but by no means to be wrested into a precedent. No, a week or 2 would limber up her piety, and then she would be rational again, and the next $2 that she got left out in the cold would find a comforter, and she could name the comforter. Was she bad? Was she worse than the general run of her race? No. They had an unfair show in the battle of life. They held it no sin to take military advantage of the enemy in a small way, but not in a large one. They would smooch provisions from the pantry wherever they got a chance, or a brass thimble, or cake of wax, or an emery bag, or a paper of needles, or a silver spoon, or a dollar bill, or small articles of clothing, or any other property of light value, and so far they were from considering such reprisals sinful, that they would go to church and shout and pray the loudest and sincerest with their plunder in their pockets. Well, if you're collecting silver, that's not, you're going beyond their needs, but, a farm smokehouse had to be kept heavily padlocked, for even the colored deacon himself could not resist a ham when Providence showed him, in a dream or otherwise, where such a thing hung, lonesome, and longed for someone to love. But with 100 hanging before him, the deacon would not take 2, that is, on the same night. On frosty nights, the humane Negro prowler would warm the end of a plank and put it up under the cold claws of chickens roosting in a tree. A drowsy hen would step onto the comfortable board, softly clucking her gratitude, and the prowler would dump her into his bag and later into his stomach, perfectly sure that in taking this trifle from the man who daily robbed him of an inestimable treasury, his liberty would not be committing any sin that God would remember against him in the last great day. Well, again, there's a difference between the need and the want. So if they're patching their clothes or, getting some food, and they should be given the food that the level of food and clothing that their masters have. That's perfectly reasonable. But I also oppose wars and raids for the sake of gaining slaves. So, Name the thief. For the fourth time, Mr. Driscoll had said it, and always in the same hard tone. And now he added these words of awful import. I give you 1 minute. He took out his watch. If at the end of that time you have not confessed, I will not only sell all 4 of you, but I will sell you down the river. It was the equivalent to condemning them to hell. No Missouri Negro doubted this. Roxy reeled in her tracks, and the color vanished out of her face, and the others dropped to their knees as if they had been shot. Tears gushed from their eyes. Their supplicating hands went up, and 3 answers came in the one instant. I done it, I done it, I done it. Have mercy, master. Lord, have mercy on us, poor negroes. I'm not saying the other word in this context. Very good, said the master, putting up his watch. I will sell you here, though you don't deserve it. You ought to be sold down the river. The culprits flung themselves prone into an ecstasy of gratitude and kissed his feet, declaring that they would never forget his goodness and never cease to pray for him as long as they lived. They were sincere, for like a god he had stretched forth his mighty hand and closed the gates of hell against them. He knew himself that he had done a noble and gracious thing, and was privately well pleased with his magnanimity, and that night he set the incident down in his diary, so that his son might read it in after years, and be thereby moved to deeds of gentleness and humanity himself. Chapter 3. Roxy Plays a Shrewd Trick. Whoever has lived long enough to find out what life is knows how deep a debt of gratitude we owe to Adam, the first great benefactor of our race. He brought death into the world. Pudd'nhead, Wilson's Calendar. Percy Driscoll slept well the night. He saved the house minions from going down the river, but no wink of sleep visited Roxy's eyes. A profound terror had taken possession of her. Her child could grow up and be sold down the river. The thought crazed her with horror. If she dozed and lost herself for a moment, the next moment she was on her feet, flying to her child's cradle to see if it was still there. Then she would gather it to her heart and pour out her love upon it in a frenzy of kisses, moaning, crying, and saying, "They shan't, oh, they shan't. Your poor mommy will kill you first." Yeah, yeah, people have been convinced of this sort of thing, but no, yeah, it's one thing when people set things up so the army is going to find it easier, the invading armies are going to find it easier to kill people than to take them off captives. But to actually do the killing, then one's doing something enormously wrong, right? Once, when she was tucking it back in its cradle again, the other child nestled in its sleep and attracted her attention. She went and stood over it a long time, communing with herself. What has my po' baby done that couldn't have your luck? He hain't done nothing. God was good to you. Why weren't he good to him? They can't sell you down the river. I hates your papa. He ain't got no heart. For blacks he hain't, anyways. I hates him, and I could kill him. She paused a while, thinking. Then she burst into wild sobbings again, and turned away, saying, "Oh, I got to kill my child. There ain't no other way. Killing him would save a child from going down the river." "Oh, I got to do it. Your Pamami's got to kill you to save you, honey." Well, people die when they're children, they're innocent, but yeah, no. Uh, she gathered her baby to her bosom now and began to smother it with caresses. "Mommy's got to kill you. How can I do it? But your mama ain't gwine to desert you. No, no. Dad, don't cry. She gwine with you, and she gwine to kill herself too. Come along, you honey. Come along with Mama. We gwine to jump in the river, and then the troubles of this world is all over. They don't sell blacks down the river over yonder." Well, that's exactly how you know, get sold down, damn down, the hell by your own thing, right? She started towards the door, turning to the child and hushing it. Midway, she stopped suddenly. She had caught sight of her new Sunday gown, a cheap curtain calico thing, a conflagration of gaudy colors and fantastic figures. She surveyed it wistfully, longfully. "Hadn't ever worn it yet," she said, "and it's just lovely." Then she nodded her head in response to a pleasant idea and added, "No, I ain't gwine to be fished out, wid everybody looking at me in his mis'able ol' linsey-woolsey." She put down the child and made the change. She looked in the glass and was astonished in her beauty. She resolved to make her death toilet perfect. She took off her handkerchief turban and dressed her glossy wealth of hair like white folks. She added some odds and ends of rather lurid ribbon and a spray of atrocious artificial flowers. Finally, she threw over her shoulders a fluffy thing called a cloud in that day, which was of a blazing red complexion. Then she was ready for the tune. She gathered up her baby once more, but when her eye fell upon its miserably short little gray tow linen shirt, and noted the contrast between its pauper shabbiness and her own volcanic eruption of infernal splendors, her mother heart was touched, and she was ashamed. "No, darling, mammy ain't gwine to treat you so. The angels is gwine to marry you just as much as they does you, mama. Ain't gwine to have 'em puttin' they hands up for days and saying to David and Goliath and them you're their prophets. Dat chile is dressed too indelicate for this place." By this time, she had stripped off the shirt, and now she clothed the naked little creature in one of Thomas A. Beckett's snowy long baby gowns, with its bright blue bows and dainty flummery of ruffles. Done now, you's fixed. She propped the child in a chair and stood off to inspect it. Straightway her eyes began to widen with astonishment and admiration, and she clapped her hands and cried out, "Why, it do beat all! I never knowed you was so lovely. Marse Tommy ain't a bit puttier, not a single bit." She stepped over and glanced at the other infant. She flung the glance back at her own. Then, one more at the air of the house. Now a strange light dawned in her eyes, and in a moment she was lost in thought. She seemed in a trance. When she came out of it, she muttered, "When I us a washing 'em in the tub, it's the day his own pappy asked me which of 'em was his'n." She began to move about like one in a dream. She undressed Thomas A. Becket, stripping him of everything, and put the linen shirt on him. She put his coral necklace on her own child's neck. Then she placed the children side by side, and after earnest inspection, she muttered, "Now, who would believe clothes could do like Odette? Dog my cats, if I ain't all I can do to tell the other from which, let alone his pappy." She put her cub in Tommy's elegant cradle and said, "Use young Marse Tommy from this out, and I got to practice and get used to 'memberin' to call you dat, honey, or I's gwine to make a mistake some time and get us both into trouble. Then now you lay still and don't fret no more. Marse Tom, oh, thank the good Lord in heaven, you saved. There ain't no man kin ever sell mommy's poor little honey down the river now." She put the air of the house in her own child's unpainted pine cradle and said, contemplating its slumbering form uneasily, "I's sorry for you, honey. I's sorry. God knows I is. But what can I do? What could I do? Your pappy would sell him to somebody sometime, and then he'd go down the river, sure, and I couldn't stand it." She flung herself on her bed and began to think and toss and think. By and by she sat suddenly upright, for a comforting thought had flown through her worried mind. "'Tain't no sin white folks had done it. It ain't no sin, glory to goodness, it ain't no sin. They's done it, yes, and they was the biggest quality in the whole villain, too, kings." She began to muse, and she was trying to gather out of her memory the dim particulars of some tale she had heard some time or another. At last she said, "Now I's got it. Now I 'member. It was that old Negro preacher that told it. The time that he come over here from Illinois, and preaching in that Negro church, he said, 'They ain't nobody kin save his own self. Can't do it by faith, can't do it by works, can't do it no way at all. Free grace is the only way, and that don't come from nobody, but just the Lord, and he can give it to anybody he please, saint or sinner. He don't care." And we'll continue further.